The Plague of Athens, 430 to 426 BCE. In the summer of 430 BCE, as the Peloponnesian War raged between Athens and Sparta, an invisible enemy struck the heart of the ancient world. The city of Athens, crowded with refugees behind its fortified walls, was suddenly gripped by a mysterious and deadly epidemic. Within days, the symptoms were unmistakable: high fevers, unquenchable thirst, red eyes, and violent coughing fits. Victims suffered from vomiting, ulcers, and a relentless sense of despair. The disease spread rapidly, sparing no one, from the poorest citizens to the city's most powerful leaders. The historian Thucydides, himself a survivor, described scenes of chaos and suffering. Families abandoned the sick in fear. Temples overflowed with the dead, and the city's funeral pyres burned day and night. Social order collapsed as people lost faith in the gods and the government. Even Pericles, the legendary Athenian statesman, fell victim to the plague, leaving Athens leaderless at a critical moment in its history. Estimates suggest that up to one-third of Athens' population, tens of thousands of people, died in just a few years. The exact cause of the plague remains a mystery to this day. Some modern researchers believe it may have been typhus, smallpox, or even Ebola-like hemorrhagic fever, but no consensus has been reached. What is certain is the devastating impact. The Athenian military was weakened, morale was shattered, and the city's political and social fabric was torn apart. The Plague of Athens didn't just kill thousands, it changed the course of history. Athens, once the most powerful city-state in Greece, never fully recovered. The epidemic contributed to its eventual defeat by Sparta and marked the beginning of the end for the Golden Age of Athens. The story of the plague remains a haunting reminder of how disease can shape the fate of entire civilizations, often in ways no one can predict. The Great Plague of London, 1665 to 1666. In the sweltering summer of 1665, London was a city on the brink. The air was thick, the streets crowded, and an invisible killer was about to strike. It began quietly, in the poor and densely packed parish of St. Giles in the Fields. At first, only a handful of deaths were reported, but within weeks, the numbers soared. The city's bells tolled endlessly, marking the passing of hundreds, then thousands, of Londoners. The cause was the bubonic plague, carried by fleas living on black rats. The disease spread with terrifying speed, showing no mercy to rich or poor. Victims developed painful swellings, known as buboes, followed by fever, vomiting, and delirium. Most died within days. Entire households were locked inside their homes, doors marked with a red cross and the chilling words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Watchmen patrolled the streets to ensure no one escaped quarantine. Panic gripped the city. Those who could afford to flee, including King Charles II and his court, abandoned London for the countryside. Doctors, overwhelmed and powerless, resorted to desperate measures: bloodletting, herbal remedies, and even smoking tobacco, which was thought to ward off the disease. The dead were collected at night and buried in mass graves, as the city's graveyards quickly overflowed. By the time the plague finally subsided in the autumn of 1666, it had claimed the lives of an estimated 100,000 people, about a quarter of London's population. The social and economic impact was devastating. Businesses collapsed, trade ground to a halt, and the city's poor were left destitute. The trauma of the plague lingered long after the last case faded. Ironically, just as London began to recover, another disaster struck: the Great Fire of 1666, which destroyed much of the city. Some historians believe the fire helped end the plague by burning down the crowded, rat-infested neighborhoods where the disease had thrived. The Great Plague of London remains one of the darkest chapters in the city's history, a stark reminder of how quickly life can change and how communities respond in the face of unimaginable loss. The Russian Plague, 1770 to 1772. In the early 1770s, as the Russian Empire was locked in war with the Ottoman Turks, a silent and deadly threat crept into its heart. The city of Moscow, already crowded and unsanitary, became the epicenter of one of the deadliest outbreaks in Russian history: the Russian Plague of 1770 to 1772. It began quietly, with soldiers and refugees returning from the front lines, unknowingly carrying the bubonic plague. At first, the authorities tried to keep the outbreak a secret, fearing panic and unrest. But as the death toll mounted, the truth could no longer be hidden. Within months, the disease was spreading uncontrollably through Moscow's narrow streets and crowded markets. Victims developed high fevers, painful swellings, and blackened skin. Entire families perished in their homes. The city's hospitals and churches overflowed with the sick and dying. In a desperate attempt to contain the plague, Empress Catherine the Great ordered strict quarantines and the closure of public spaces. But these measures only fueled public anger and suspicion. As fear and frustration grew, Moscow descended into chaos. In September 1771, a violent riot erupted after Archbishop Ambrosius ordered the removal of a revered religious icon, hoping to prevent crowds from gathering and spreading the disease. The mob stormed the Kremlin, blaming officials and clergy for the suffering. The archbishop was killed, and order broke down completely. By the time the epidemic finally subsided in 1772, the Russian plague had claimed the lives of at least 50,000 people in Moscow alone. Some estimates put the number even higher. The city was left traumatized, its population decimated, and its economy in ruins. The government's slow and secretive response became a lesson in the dangers of misinformation and mistrust during a public health crisis. The Russian plague of 1770 to 1772 remains a stark reminder of how disease can ignite not just fear, but social upheaval. It exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most powerful empires, and its legacy would shape Russian public health policy for generations to come. The Antonine Plague, 165 to 180 CE. In the 2nd century CE, as the Roman Empire stood at the height of its power, an invisible enemy began to spread from its distant frontiers. The Antonine Plague, named after the ruling Antonine dynasty, erupted in 165 CE, likely brought back by Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the east. What started as a mysterious illness among the troops quickly swept across the empire, reaching every corner from Egypt to Gaul. The symptoms were terrifying and unfamiliar. Victims suffered from high fevers, chills, diarrhea, and a distinctive skin rash that would scab over and blacken. Many died within days. Ancient sources, including the physician Galen, described the suffering in vivid detail, but even he was powerless to stop the disease. Modern historians believe the Antonine Plague was probably smallpox, though some argue it could have been measles. The impact was catastrophic. At its peak, the plague is estimated to have killed up to 2,000 people a day in Rome alone. Over the course of 15 years, as many as 5 to 10 million people, roughly a quarter of the empire's population, may have perished. The death toll devastated the Roman army, weakened the economy, and left entire towns and villages deserted. The psychological toll was just as severe. People lost faith in the old gods, and the social fabric of the empire began to fray. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher king, was forced to spend much of his reign dealing with the crisis. He watched as his co-emperor Lucius Verus succumbed to the disease, and he himself may have died from it in 180 CE. The Antonine Plague marked a turning point for Rome. The empire survived, but it was never quite the same. The manpower shortage made it harder to defend the borders, and the economic strain lingered for decades. Some historians even argue that the Antonine Plague set the stage for the eventual decline of the Roman Empire. The story of the Antonine Plague is a powerful reminder of how disease can change the course of history, toppling empires, reshaping societies, and leaving scars that last for centuries. The Cocoliztli Epidemics, 16th century Mexico. In the heart of the 16th century, as the Spanish conquest reshaped the Americas, a far deadlier force swept across what is now Mexico. The indigenous peoples called it Cocoliztli, a word meaning pestilence in Nahuatl. What followed were two of the deadliest epidemics in human history, striking in 1545 and again in 1576, and leaving a legacy of devastation that would change the continent forever. The first outbreak began in the highlands of central Mexico, in communities already weakened by war, forced labor, and the upheaval of Spanish rule. The symptoms were terrifying and swift: high fevers, intense headaches, blackened tongues, and severe bleeding from the nose, mouth, and eyes. Victims often died within days. The disease spread rapidly, sparing neither children nor elders, and entire villages were wiped out in a matter of weeks. Spanish chroniclers and indigenous scribes alike described the horror. The dead were so numerous that survivors could not bury them all. Fields were left untended, cities emptied, and the social fabric of entire civilizations unraveled. The Spanish, immune to some old-world diseases but not to this new scourge, were also affected, but the indigenous population suffered the most. Modern scientists still debate the true cause of Cocoliztli. Some believe it was a viral hemorrhagic fever, possibly made worse by years of drought and malnutrition. Others suggest it was a form of typhus or salmonella, introduced or exacerbated by the arrival of Europeans and their animals. What is certain is the scale of the disaster. Estimates suggest that between 7 and 15 million people, up to 80% of the native population, died in just a few years. The impact was irreversible. The great Aztec and Mixtec civilizations, already weakened by conquest, were shattered. The demographic collapse paved the way for Spanish domination and the transformation of the Americas. The Cocoliztli epidemics remain one of history's most haunting examples of how disease can be as powerful as any army, reshaping nations and erasing entire cultures almost overnight. The Asian flu, 1957 to 1958. In the spring of 1957, as the world was still recovering from the devastation of World War II, a new and invisible threat began to emerge in the Chinese province of Guizhou. It started quietly, with reports of a strange and severe respiratory illness spreading rapidly through local communities. But within months, the virus, an entirely new strain of influenza known as H2N2, had crossed borders and oceans, setting off a global pandemic that would become known as the Asian flu. The virus moved with astonishing speed. By the summer, it had reached Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. International air travel, still a relatively new phenomenon, helped the flu leap continents. By the fall of 1957, outbreaks were reported in the United Kingdom, the United States, and across Europe. Schools, military bases, and factories became hotspots for infection. Hospitals were quickly overwhelmed, and public health officials scrambled to respond. The symptoms were familiar but severe. High fever, chills, sore throat, muscle aches, and a relentless cough. For most, the illness was unpleasant but survivable. But for the very young, the elderly, and those with weakened immune systems, the Asian flu could be deadly. In some communities, entire families fell ill at once, and absentee rates in schools and workplaces soared. Governments raced to develop and distribute a vaccine, a feat accomplished in record time for the era. Still, the virus claimed a heavy toll. By the time the pandemic subsided in 1958, it had killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people worldwide. In the United States alone, nearly 70,000 people lost their lives. The Asian flu was a wake-up call for the modern world. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a rapidly globalizing society and highlighted the importance of international cooperation in the face of emerging diseases. The lessons learned would shape public health responses for decades to come, including the development of global surveillance systems and the rapid production of vaccines. The Asian flu of 1957 to 1958 stands as a stark reminder that even in an age of scientific progress, humanity remains vulnerable to the ever-changing threats posed by infectious diseases. The Plague of Justinian, 541 to 542 CE. In the year 541 CE, the mighty Byzantine Empire was at its zenith, ruled by Emperor Justinian the Great. But as the empire expanded its borders and built its grand monuments, a silent killer arrived in its capital, Constantinople, and changed the course of history forever. This was the Plague of Justinian, the first recorded pandemic of bubonic plague. It began in the bustling ports of Egypt, likely carried by rats and fleas aboard grain ships bound for the heart of the empire. The disease spread with terrifying speed, moving along trade routes and rivers, reaching Constantinople in the spring of 542. At first, the symptoms seemed like any other illness: fever, chills, and fatigue. But soon, victims developed painful, swollen lymph nodes, known as buboes, followed by delirium, vomiting, and, in many cases, death within days. The city was overwhelmed. At the height of the outbreak, thousands died every day. The dead piled up in homes and streets, and there were not enough people left to bury them. Emperor Justinian himself fell ill but miraculously survived. The government struggled to maintain order, and the economy ground to a halt as fear and despair gripped the population. Historians estimate that the plague of Justinian killed between 25 and 50 million people across the Mediterranean world, perhaps as much as half the population of Constantinople and a quarter of the entire Eastern Roman Empire. The devastation was so severe that it crippled the empire's military and economic power, leaving it vulnerable to invasions and internal strife. The long-term impact was profound. The plague returned in waves for the next 2 centuries, weakening the empire and contributing to the loss of its western territories. Some historians even argue that the Plague of Justinian marked the true beginning of the end for the ancient world, paving the way for the rise of medieval Europe and the Islamic caliphates. The Plague of Justinian stands as a stark reminder of how disease can bring even the greatest empires to their knees, reshaping the destiny of nations and the course of human history. The Third Plague Pandemic, 1855 to 1960. In the mid-19th century, as the world was rapidly changing with new trade routes, steamships, and bustling cities, an ancient terror re-emerged. The Third Plague Pandemic began in 1855 in the Chinese province of Yunnan, a remote region known for its rugged mountains and gold mines. But what started as a local outbreak would soon become a global catastrophe, lasting more than a century and killing millions. The disease was the same deadly foe that had haunted humanity for centuries: bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and spread by fleas on rats. The pandemic first exploded in the crowded city of Canton, now Guangzhou, and quickly reached the bustling port of Hong Kong. From there, the plague hitched rides on steamships, spreading to India, Southeast Asia, Africa, the Americas, and even Australia. The impact in India was especially devastating. Over the next 50 years, the plague killed more than 12 million people there alone. Entire neighborhoods in cities like Bombay, now Mumbai, were quarantined, and the British colonial authorities imposed harsh measures, burning homes, forcing evacuations, and even using military force to control the panic. The fear of the plague was so great that it sparked riots and resistance, as people distrusted the authorities and their drastic interventions. But the third plague pandemic was also a turning point in medical history. For the first time, scientists were able to identify the cause of the disease. In 1894, during an outbreak in Hong Kong, Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss-French bacteriologist, discovered the plague bacillus that now bears his name. This breakthrough led to the development of new treatments and the beginnings of modern public health responses. Despite these advances, the pandemic continued to flare up in waves, reaching as far as San Francisco in the early 1900s and causing outbreaks in port cities around the world. The last major cases were reported in the 1950s, but the legacy of the third plague pandemic endures. It changed the way nations responded to infectious disease, led to the creation of international health organizations, and left scars on communities from Asia to Africa. The third plague pandemic is a stark reminder that even in an age of progress, the old enemies of humanity can return, and that global cooperation and scientific discovery are our best defenses against the next great threat. The HIV/AIDS pandemic, 1980s present. In the early 1980s, doctors in the United States began to notice a mysterious and deadly illness spreading among young men in major cities like Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco. Patients arrived with rare infections and cancers, their immune systems seemingly destroyed. At first, no one knew what was causing it. The disease was terrifying, unpredictable, and almost always fatal. It would soon become known as AIDS, caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. As the decade unfolded, the epidemic exploded across the globe. It did not discriminate. It spread through blood, sexual contact, and from mother to child, affecting people of every age, gender, and background. By the mid-1980s, cases were being reported in Africa, Europe, Asia, and beyond. The world was facing a new kind of pandemic, one that moved silently, often for years, before symptoms appeared. The impact was devastating. In the early years, fear and stigma surrounded the disease. Many patients were shunned by their communities, and misinformation was rampant. Governments were slow to respond, and funding for research lagged behind the growing crisis. By the 1990s, HIV/AIDS had become the leading cause of death for young adults in many countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where entire generations were lost. But the story of HIV/AIDS is also one of resilience and scientific progress. Activists fought for awareness, compassion, and funding. Researchers raced to understand the virus, and by the mid-1990s, new antiretroviral drugs transformed HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition for millions. Prevention campaigns, education, and access to treatment began to turn the tide. Still, the numbers are staggering. Since the start of the pandemic, more than 40 million people have died from AIDS-related illnesses, and tens of millions more live with HIV today. The fight is far from over. In many parts of the world, stigma, poverty, and lack of access to healthcare continue to fuel the epidemic. The HIV/AIDS pandemic stands as one of the greatest public health challenges in modern history, a reminder of the power of science, the importance of compassion, and the ongoing struggle for health equity around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic, 2019 present. In late 2019, as the world prepared to welcome a new decade, a cluster of mysterious pneumonia cases emerged in the city of Wuhan, China. Few could have predicted that these early reports would mark the beginning of the most disruptive global health crisis in a century, the COVID-19 pandemic. The disease, caused by a novel coronavirus named SARS-CoV-2, spread with unprecedented speed. Within weeks, cases appeared across Asia, Europe, and the Americas. By March 2020, the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. Borders closed, cities locked down, and daily life changed almost overnight. Streets that once bustled with activity fell silent. Schools, businesses, and places of worship shut their doors. For billions, the world suddenly felt smaller and more uncertain than ever before. COVID-19 symptoms range from mild cough and fever to severe respiratory distress and organ failure. For some, the illness passed quickly. For others, especially the elderly and those with underlying health conditions, it proved deadly. Hospitals in hotspots like Italy, New York, and India were overwhelmed. Medical workers risked their lives, often without enough protective equipment, as they fought to save patients in crowded intensive care units. The numbers are staggering. As of now, COVID-19 has claimed millions of lives worldwide and infected hundreds of millions more. The true toll may never be fully known. The pandemic also triggered a global economic crisis, with job losses, business closures, and supply chain disruptions affecting nearly every country. Mental health struggles, isolation, and grief became part of daily life for countless people. But the story of COVID-19 is also one of resilience and scientific achievement. In record time, researchers developed effective vaccines, and mass vaccination campaigns began in 2021. Communities found new ways to connect, support each other, and adapt to a changed world. The pandemic accelerated trends in remote work, digital communication, and public health awareness. Yet, the crisis also exposed deep inequalities between nations, within societies, and in access to healthcare. Misinformation, vaccine hesitancy, and political divisions complicated the response. Even as restrictions eased and life began to return to normal in some places, new variants and waves of infection reminded the world that the fight was not over. The COVID-19 pandemic will be remembered as a defining event of the 21st century, a time when the world was tested and when the choices of individuals, communities, and leaders shaped the course of history. The Spanish flu, 1918 to 1919. In the final year of World War I, as the world was already reeling from years of brutal conflict, a new and invisible enemy emerged, one that would claim more lives than the war itself. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919 swept across the globe with astonishing speed and ferocity, infecting an estimated one-third of the world's population and killing at least 50 million people. Some estimates put the toll even higher. The origins of the Spanish flu remain a mystery. Despite its name, the pandemic did not start in Spain. Some historians believe it began in the United States, France, or even China. But because Spain was neutral during the war and had a free press, Spanish newspapers were among the first to report openly on the outbreak, giving the pandemic its misleading name. The symptoms were sudden and severe. Victims developed high fevers, chills, body aches, and a relentless cough. For many, the illness quickly progressed to pneumonia and acute respiratory failure. Unlike most flu viruses, which are deadliest for the very young and the elderly, the Spanish flu struck hardest at healthy young adults in their 20s and 30s. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and makeshift wards sprang up in schools, churches, and community centers. In some cities, bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The pandemic came in 3 brutal waves. The second wave, in the autumn of 1918, was the deadliest. Communities around the world imposed quarantines, closed public spaces, and urged people to wear masks. But with the war still raging, troop movements and crowded conditions helped the virus spread even further. The impact was staggering. The Spanish flu killed more people in a single year than the Black Death had in a century. It left millions of children orphaned and devastated economies already weakened by war. In some places, entire villages disappeared. The psychological scars lingered for decades, but the pandemic also spurred advances in public health, epidemiology, and global cooperation. The Spanish flu remains one of the deadliest events in human history, a stark reminder of how quickly a virus can change the world, and how resilience, science, and solidarity are our best defenses against the next great pandemic. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351. In the mid-14th century, a silent terror swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, leaving devastation in its wake. The Black Death, as it would come to be known, was the deadliest pandemic in recorded history, an event that changed the course of civilization forever. It began in 1347, when trading ships arrived in Sicily carrying a deadly cargo, rats infested with fleas, and those fleas carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The disease spread with terrifying speed, moving along trade routes from port cities in Italy to France, Spain, England, and beyond. Within months, entire towns were gripped by panic as the plague advanced relentlessly. The symptoms were unmistakable and horrifying. Victims developed sudden fevers, chills, and painful, swollen lymph nodes, known as buboes, that turned black, giving the disease its infamous name. In many cases, death came within days. The plague didn't discriminate. Peasants, nobles, priests, and merchants all fell victim. In some places, entire families and villages vanished almost overnight. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. Historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died, up to half the population of Europe at the time. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London lost thousands in a matter of weeks. The social order broke down as fear and desperation took hold. Doctors were powerless, and many believed the plague was a punishment from God. Some turned to prayer, others to violence, scapegoating minorities and outsiders in a desperate search for answers. But the Black Death was more than just a tragedy, it was a turning point. The massive loss of life led to labor shortages, economic upheaval, and the collapse of the feudal system. Wages rose, and survivors found new opportunities. Art, literature, and science were forever changed by the trauma and the questions the plague left behind. The Black Death remains a haunting reminder of humanity's vulnerability to disease, and of our ability to adapt and rebuild in the face of unimaginable loss. Its legacy can still be felt today, in the very fabric of modern society.